Welcome to Conservative One, the podcast defending traditions and freedoms with George Christensen.
Never give in. Never give in. Never, never, never.
You and I have the courage to say to our enemies, there is a price we will not pay. There is a point beyond which they must not advance.
Socialists don't like ordinary people choosing, for they might not choose socialism.
We cannot afford to be so politically correct anymore.
Conservative One.
Well, g'day, I'm George Christensen, your host here at this brand new podcast, Conservative One, the podcast that is defending traditions and freedom. And we're going to be interviewing quite a number of very interesting individuals, people that are experts in their field, people who are conservative activists and writers. And obviously the name of the show, Conservative One, means that this whole podcast series is coming at life from a very conservative worldview. And I'm joined actually today for our very first podcast of Conservative One by a young man, 35 years old. He is a blogger. He is also a published writer in many different journals, from The Spectator magazine through to the Christian online magazine, Mercator Net, also the conservative online journal Cauldron Pool, a Christian newspaper, Eternity News, published his stuff. His name is Kurt Mahlburg. He runs a blog called Cross and Culture. Kurt, what's a young fellow like you doing, blogging all of this conservative stuff? Because, mate, I've seen your work and it's great. But tell us your background, how you got into this.
Thanks so much, George. It's an honour to be with you, especially on your first show. And this is a real privilege. And thank you for that introduction as well. Well, I guess, young people aren't supposed to be conservative, are they? We're supposed to be liberal and, spouting whatever the media tells us we should be believing. But I guess my background is I've grown up in the Adelaide Hills. I grew up in the Lutheran church, and I was a pastor in the Baptist church for 5 years, a youth and young adults pastor. I've lived in Indonesia for a couple of years. I've travelled a fair bit. I just married my beautiful American wife, and so we've had some interesting challenges navigating trying to have a wedding in Australia with a lot of American guests. And
I heard about that.
Yeah, so
you were caught up with all the pandemic lockdown.
We were quite affected by it. We're hoping to actually have a wedding in a year on our anniversary, even though we did have a very small ceremony and are officially married. But that's more recent stuff. In terms of, I guess, like my blogging journey and my thinking and that sort of stuff, I guess I've always liked to ask questions, and I've always liked to challenge what I've been told, not for its own sake, but because I want to think through things for myself. And though I grew up in the Lutheran church, I had plenty of doubts and skepticism about faith, about the Bible, about God. But I think it was a healthy one. It wasn't just railing against it. It was more wanting to understand things for myself and just not take easy answers. And so I remember being of that persuasion probably in my teenage years. And then as I got older, I guess I started to study a lot. I was a bit of a bookworm. I loved reading theology and philosophy. And then when I went on staff at the church I was pastor of, I started preaching, and I guess a lot of the ideas I had to find feet on the ground in the real world, in the trenches, with people who are, struggling and going through highs and lows. And I think that probably rounded me off a little bit as well from maybe a harder conservative edge when I was younger. But when I was on staff at church, I would occasionally just think to myself, that sermon might work as a blog. And so I just kind of post it. And it was really experimental, very few people reading it. I didn't really care whether people were reading it or not. But as time went on, I realized there's a lot of topics I wasn't, able to preach on because they were sort of in a niche area. And so I'd actually turn those into blogs. And that's really where the blog began. And I've just continued that on. And I guess my thinking has somewhat evolved through the years, but still, I guess, challenging the status quo, expressing my faith and how that intersects with culture. And, any big topic that seems to come along that grabs my interest is generally where I'll go. I've been very privileged to have a reading in various online journals, and I'm currently working with the Canberra Declaration, which is a conservative Christian, I guess, values institute, you could call it. Their main focuses are things like right to life, religious freedom, and the value of marriage and family. And so that's been an honour working with Warwick Marsh and the crew there. So that's been for about 18 months I've been working with them. And so some of my work with them has been able to cross over into my blog and vice versa. So
can you tell listeners a little bit more about the Canberra Declaration? Because that's a very important thing that doesn't get too much attention. So explain what the Canberra Declaration actually is.
That's true, yeah. And so with the Canberra Declaration, I guess the name is a little bit interesting. It actually follows on from the Manhattan Declaration. It was a statement that was written maybe 15 or so years ago by conservatives in America. A lot of them were pastors or Christian leaders, and essentially they saw the erosion of faith values, and particularly around things like right to life and marriage and freedom. And so they put together the Manhattan Declaration, and then following in the footsteps of that, or inspired by it, a group in Australia about 10 years ago put together the Canberra Declaration. And if you just Google Canberra Declaration, you'll be able to go straight to our website and be able to read what that declaration says. It's not particularly long, but it's really lucid and gets across these values of the fact that all of us are made in the image of God, and therefore, everyone has a right to life from life's start to natural end, and that marriage and family are, the cornerstone of a healthy society, and they should be valued and treasured. Not to say that, to be married is the ultimate life stage, but it is a good thing, and it is something that governments, it's in their best interests to protect marriage and to protect families. And to preserve these traditions that we've, practiced for thousands of years. And while the Christian faith has been a huge part of that, I guess a lot of religious traditions have really strengthened, our understanding of the family unit. And, the Christian faith really does underpin those values. And so I guess pointing back to the scriptures and just valuing the traditions that our culture has given us. So that's kind of a bit of a background to what they do. There's, I think, about 80 or so thousand, maybe 85,000 people that have signed the Canberra Declaration to just express their support for these values, which is pretty awesome. And we have maybe 30 or so thousand people on our email list. But just really encourage you to jump online and have a read of that and sign it if you're all for it. And just jump on our mailing list as well, because we tend to send an email out every week or so, just highlighting different current issues and ways that Christians can pray. And not just Christians either. There are people who just are of a conservative bent who follow our work, or maybe they're from a Judeo background, Jewish background, or just maybe they have more libertarian views, but they share this value of our strong traditional foundations in culture. So, check it out.
Fantastic. Well, I can encourage people to go to the Canberra Declaration and have a look into what that great organisation is doing. That both Warwick Marsh and Kurt, who's joining me here, are leading. So, Kurt, you've been a youth pastor. Mm-hmm. You have some greater understanding of theology than the average person. Can
Hopefully.
you tell us? Yeah. Can you tell us? It's one of those ultimate questions. The whole of the world is going through a pretty scary time right now with this coronavirus pandemic. Yeah. Where is God amongst this?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I mean, I joked before, hopefully I know more than the average punter, but in honesty, I guess I see it as a bit of a level playing field. I'm not particularly more qualified than anyone else, but I guess I have spent a lot of time thinking about faith and spending time in scripture and in my relationship with God as well. So, where is God? I guess ultimately the Christian's answer to any question around where is God in the midst of a crisis is he's still on his throne. And that might sound simplistic, but it's pretty good at steadying the ship when everything around you is kind of shaking, or where there's suffering, or where there's a lot of confusion. It is really interesting, actually. The Bible does talk a lot about plagues, and the Bible's obviously by our culture often written off as a bit of an archaic book, but there's a lot in there about plagues and how they relate to God and our understanding of God. I think, it's probably not a popular opinion to express that plague or suffering might be a way of God getting our attention, but throughout Scripture, that's often what God is doing when any sort of suffering occurs. It's not that he necessarily enjoys, inflicting pain or suffering on people, but C.S. Lewis once said, God whispers to us through our pleasures, but he shouts to us through our pain. And pain is a megaphone for God to get the world's attention. And I'm paraphrasing, but something to that effect. And I really think it's true. I mean, I've just recently seen surveys coming out of America. I know they're probably a little bit more religious or Christian than Australia is, but nevertheless, it's probably representative of the Western world that I think almost 50% of Americans, regardless of what their background is, believe that this pandemic is a wake-up call from God of some sort. And I think 20% of non-Christian respondents to the same survey said that as a result of what's going on, they've started reading the Bible, or they've looked for sermons or teaching online about the Bible, which is pretty remarkable. And so, we see, not just in the C.S. Lewis quote, and I could just, rattle off some idea about, hardship drawing us closer to God. Well, there's some statistics for you that actually it does happen. And I think, in situations like this, God is trying to get our attention. And whether that's at a personal level, whether people need to get their hearts right with God and be at peace with him, and as a Christian, I would say that's through Jesus, knowing Jesus and having an assurance of eternal life through him, or whether that's on a national level. If we've abandoned so many of these values that shaped our culture and our freedoms and the things that we hold so dear, a lot of that stuff we now take for granted. But you trace it back, and not to say Christianity was the only influence, but Christianity played a huge role in the development of our freedoms and our education and our healthcare system, and just our worldview that says everyone's precious, everyone's life has value and worth. And if as a nation we've started to abandon that, then I think it's pretty fair to say God may be trying to get our attention through something like this. So I would say, on the one hand, he's still on his throne and nothing can shake him, nothing can set him off his purpose. And the world is going to be okay. We got through 2 world wars. I'm sure we'll get through the coronavirus. And that's not to downplay the suffering of certain individuals. I know that obviously some 60 Australians, unfortunately, have succumbed to this. And there's many around the planet. I don't know what the statistics are now, but it's sort of around 100,000 or more maybe have lost their lives. And so that's not to downplay that, but God is always in the midst of our suffering. I love Psalm 23. It's the one that's often quoted at funerals, I think. The Lord is my shepherd. What it says a little bit later on in Psalm 23 is not that God is going to spare us from every deep, dark valley, but though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. And that's the key, for you are with me. God is always with us through our suffering. He's not aloof. He's not sort of separated from us. In fact, we just celebrated Easter. Easter is all about Jesus, God taking on human flesh, stepping down into creation, stepping down into the world we live in, and experiencing all of that for himself, experiencing pain and suffering on the cross. So the God that we believe in as Christians is a God who absolutely can relate to us because he's been through all the things we have. And so we can, in a very real way, say God is with us in our suffering. He's not just sitting on his throne. He's still on his throne, but he's also wanting to be with us and be present in our mess and in our fear and our suffering.
Yeah. Look, that's really good stuff. Could I seek to clarify one point before I have some rabid lefty who might be tuning into this podcast and mishearing that, what you've just said, that God has caused this pandemic as some sort of plague upon us.
Sure.
That's not what you have said, and I don't know any serious Christians that actually would believe that. There might be some on there.
There's always a few kicks out there.
There's always a few kicks. But the reality is that God didn't cause viruses. We know that from Christian theology that in the fallen world, this is where viruses come from.
That's right.
Sin entered the world and death entered the world, and viruses come from that which is against God. Yep. But as you say, that God works through these things, and certainly as people now are, in their homes, not distracted by the busyness of the world. And, that's a sad thing because people do like their jobs and get meaning from them. As people are not distracted by that busyness, it probably gives people time to sit and think and reflect on the things that ultimately do matter.
Absolutely.
Family, faith, the big questions. So, I'm hearing what you're saying.
That's great. Yeah, I'm certainly not celebrating the crisis that we're going through, and there's all sorts of effects it's got on people, but I totally agree with you that one of the positive outcomes of it all is that, it's sort of forced us as a culture, as a nation, to just totally slow down and really consider, all sorts of things that maybe we haven't for a long time, like how much we love and value our families, and how much we really do treasure our freedoms, and how much our faith does give purpose and meaning to our lives. And if we don't have that, or we're not sure about it, to really search that out and know what we believe. Because at the end of the day, this world and all of the economy and everything that's kind of constantly going on, they're all very good things. They're gifts from God, but they're not ultimate. And one day all of that's going to finish up, and we'll head into retirement, and we won't be able to do all the things that we've done. And then we've got to start thinking about death and the next life. And why not start thinking about it much earlier in life? Why not start thinking about it now? And I think that's one of the positive things that has come out of all that's going on.
Yep, indeed.
The Conservative One podcast with George Christensen.
Now, you wrote in a recent blog these words: beginning in the 1960s, we have conducted a massive social experiment in the West. Casting off our Christian conscience, we told ourselves and each other that the highest happiness would be found in living for yourself, so long as no one else gets hurt. Decades on, we are now experiencing the fallout of it all: broken families, an epidemic of sexual abuse and domestic violence, addiction on a scale never seen, and a mental health crisis that even our biggest budgets can't afford. That's pretty poignant stuff. You see that this drift that we've had since the 1960s, and I would argue actually it's been a lot longer than that. I don't know if you've read the book The Benedict Option, but
I have. You actually recommended it to me, George, and I loved it. I read that second chapter multiple times, and I've actually been working on a book myself, which is inspired by a lot of different stuff. But yeah, his Rod Dreher's second chapter in that book is absolutely brilliant. He does trace the foundations, not only foundations of the West, but I guess the beginnings of our culture-wide turning away from God. And I picked the 1960s, but you're right, it does go back a lot further.
Yeah, the 1960s was a critical point where it seemed to rampant individualism and consumerism joined together, and away we've gone, and it sort of accelerated things from the move away from, I believe, the fundamentals of life. So how do you see this trajectory of Western civilization and Western culture?
Great question. I guess on the one hand, I wouldn't want to be the person that's too fear-mongering, because I know that can be a fairly easy position to take, and it's easy to whip people up into fear based on all this stuff. But I think that a lot of us Westerners have just not stopped to think about the journey we've been on as a culture, as a civilization, where we've come from, and also therefore where we're going. And I am absolutely convinced from a lot of reading, a lot of study, that Christianity and the Jewish faith too, but particularly in places like Australia and America, the Christian faith has played a huge role, a massive role in all of the things that we hold dear. Even the way that our government is constructed is in many ways inspired by, Moses and the elders in Exodus. And the idea of the rule of law is essentially copied from, the Ten Commandments, these laws that were written on stone and enshrined in the Ark of the Covenant that governed the nation, not some king ultimately. So and education, the idea that everyone should be able to read and write, that was, it was inspired by the reformers who first of all translated the Bible from Latin, which people in everyday Europe couldn't read, only the priests and the hierarchy of the church could read. They translated that into the vernacular languages, and then they said, well, how are people going to read it? We've got to teach them to read and write. And so, this whole idea of universal education was in many ways inspired by the Reformation. So many of these things that obviously the government, plays an important role in now in terms of education and healthcare and that sort of thing. But if you trace it back, it was not originally the government that, launched a lot of these things. It was churches, it was Christians. And then when it kind of reached a scale the churches couldn't handle anymore, then obviously the government has stepped in. And I guess as we've secularized, there's been a lot more government involvement in those things. But so the foundations of the West, way more Christian than most people realize. And if that's true, I guess my thesis in the book that I'm writing, and it probably hides behind, or hopefully
What's
not
it
hides.
called? Kurt, do you have a working title for this yet? Can you let
My
us
working title is actually the same as my blog, which is Cross and Culture. And I'm still working on the subtitle, but it's going to be something like, how Jesus can save the West from its unrest, or something to that effect. And essentially what I'm wanting to illustrate is that if it's true that our Western culture, our Western civilization has been so shaped by Christianity, then really the more that we try to cast it off, and the more that we disparage that faith, then the more we can expect that the things we enjoy about the West may fade with time. And I believe there's a lot of evidence to show that that's already happening. And so not that it's all going to come crumbling down in a day, but I guess we've got enough evidence, based on things like domestic violence rates, things like, I guess, there's suicide, there's mental health, there is family breakdown, there's divorce on a scale we've not seen in previous generations. And so many people, even who are listening, have been touched by these things. And I really think that it's very easy to criticize Christians for saying, Christianity is a solution to everything. And I'm not sort of trying to paper over things and pretend that, just have faith that fixes everything. But I would say on a civilization-wide scale, a lot of that stuff is us feeling the effects of our departure from Christianity and the meaning that it gave us as individuals and as a culture. And I just don't think there's any escaping that.
You're probably a little bit more optimistic than me, and this might be political suicide for me to say, but I do believe that we're in the fall of Western civilization right now. As much as I would like to believe that Jesus can save the fall of that civilization, I actually don't think that it's why Jesus came. I think that it will fall, and we're living in it, actually. I mean, you've just got to look to see the level of bloodshed, the level of violence that has befallen the world, the Western world, in the last 100 years. You have a look to see all of the social ills that are happening now that are things that have never, ever happened to the level that they do these days. And fundamentally, the breakdown of human relationships. I mean, the relationships that by their nature should be the most compassionate and most loving. And we're seeing those relationships being destroyed. And, I think the trajectory is only one way, sadly. I don't know there's anything that actually can save it. I think that something new will replace it. It's not like that's the end of the world. That's just the end of a civilization. And, you can look throughout history. Obviously, the one that people turn to the most is the Roman civilization, the Roman Empire. When civilizations move away from their moorings, from their foundations, when things get too comfortable, too debauched, then there goes that civilization. And I think that's what we're living in. Well, look, do you care to comment on that, or shall we move on?
Yeah, I mean, where you said that, I mean, on the whole, I do agree with you, and I think we are heading on that trajectory. And the Roman Empire in particular, what people point out was part of their downfall was decadence and just this sense of living for myself, hedonism. It was different then. We've got a more individualistic take on that, but it was very much pleasure-seeking and power and wealth and all of these things that, us as humans in every civilization, every age, are so drawn to, as vices. And I see a lot of parallels. In fact, I have blogged on this. I'd need to look up the title, but I think it's something like, are we living in a new dark ages? And I compare a number of, traits of the, the dark ages to what we're experiencing now. And so I'd largely agree with you. I would maybe challenge you and say there is one thing that can rescue us, rescue our civilization from this kind of ultimate crumbling, and that would be revival. And we have seen that in many times in the past in Western history. Not that that's taught in schools, I guess, unpopular to teach on it, but we've had John Wesley and George Whitefield and many other, Jonathan Edwards in America. Billy Graham came to Australia in the 1950s. That was maybe a smaller revival than many of the other ones previously, but when people realize that there is more to life than just this life, and that there is a God they're accountable to, and not just in a negative sense of I've got to, behave and be a good little boy, but actually there's a God that gives me purpose and meaning to my life, and he's the reason that I should treat everyone with respect and dignity because they're all made in his image, and I now have purpose and meaning in my own life. That reanimates a culture, and we have seen that. We've seen, England was really in a terrible place before John Wesley came along, and at the same time as him roughly was William Wilberforce, who helped put an end to slavery. Yeah. And there was a great many Christians in that era who had a huge impact on their culture, and a lot of them were engaged in politics and social stuff and were trying to help the poor, and they were very community minded, but at the heart of their message was we've got to turn back to God individually and as a nation. And when they did, England thrived, and a lot of the good things that we would all agree have been fantastic about England's history came out of that era. And so I do believe that it is possible for us to reclaim, I guess, do you want to say the greatness of Western civilization? The best parts about us is if we were to turn back to God wholesale. But that depends on a lot of individual hearts. So,
amen, brother. Could I ask then, though, as the trajectory of Western civilization and Christianity diverge, which they have, unless there is that revival you're talking about, I think they'll continue to diverge. Mm-hmm. You've written about the clash between Christians, traditional Christians, I guess you could say, and the culture we live in. That to a lot of people is a bit difficult to take because they go to church every weekend. Mm-hmm. They don't see any persecution, but I think differently. I'm pretty sure you think differently on that. Mm-hmm. We do see some forms of persecution. It's not, martyrdom and bloodshed, thank goodness. But what forms of persecution are you seeing, and how is this divergence between culture and Christianity going? Where is it leading?
Yeah, I've looked at the persecuted church or the underground church, which I guess often we think of places like China, Indonesia, who's a close neighbour of Australia, and many Middle Eastern nations, and certainly before the fall of the Berlin Wall, the Soviet Union, there was a lot of persecution of Christians there. And so I've read a lot of biographies of believers from that era and from those parts of the world. And I've spent a couple of years in Indonesia, where the place I went to was really affected by religious violence and some would even say genocide of Christians in the area that I went to. And so I guess I'm a bit reluctant to use the word persecution too quickly of Westerners. But certainly, in fact, I would have said that maybe 2 years ago. But then last year happened. And for those that followed the stories, probably that would have been just about every Australian, Israel Folau was absolutely dragged through the mud by the media and by a lot of online commentators. And I think he probably expressed his faith in quite a prickly way and could have gone about it better in certain ways.
Yeah,
and maybe he's not the most articulate guy, but and there's differences that I have with him in terms of belief too. But he was, at the end of the day, just expressing his personal faith. He was doing it in social media, in private. It's a public platform, sure, but he was doing it, not on the books. He wasn't being paid to be at home tweeting or whatever. And he was absolutely maligned and
fired.
Yeah, well, he was fired. Yeah, he was fired, and he had his career destroyed and his means of income taken away, and all of that basically, at the end of the day, for quoting the Bible, for paraphrasing the Bible.
That's right.
And a lot of people just loved it. A lot of, and I know most Australians probably sided with him in the end, even if they didn't agree with him. They probably felt for him and thought, this is not the fair go of the Australia I've grown up in. But there were a lot of players in the chattering class, I suppose, who just couldn't get enough of it and loved seeing what happened to him. And then, of course, we also saw what happened with Margaret Court. And she also, essentially, for her Christian views on a whole range of subjects, was, really treated unfairly, was not given equal treatment in terms of her 50th anniversary with the Australian Open. So, yeah. It is really
a new form of deplatforming. It's now
exactly
dethroning our sports stars simply because they don't conform to the leftist groupthink that they're supposed to conform to.
That's exactly right. And in Australia, our sports heroes, we, maybe more than any other nation, we really lift them up. And so it's really significant that two of our greatest sporting heroes were deplatformed, cancelled, whatever you want to call it, simply for being Christians. And so even though, Israel Folau has savings and properties that he can, fall back on, and it's not like it's incomparable to the persecuted church in, say, China, but it is still persecution, and we should be wary. This is the canary in the coal mine, and we should not quickly shrug off this stuff and say, oh, he's a big boy, he's famous, so he'll be fine. If they can do it to big sporting heroes like Israel Folau or Margaret Court, they can do it to little Christians, to little people, not even Christians. They can do it to anyone if you don't agree with them and their worldview. And so, there is some really concerning stuff going on there, for sure.
Yeah. Well, it is very concerning stuff, and I guess that's why we're looking at the prospect of Religious Discrimination Act, or something that's legislative that enshrines religious liberty and religious freedom. That may be a discussion that we have on another occasion.
Yep.
For now, can I end with this question? The question is, if you were Prime Minister of Australia for a day, what's the one big decision that you would make?
Wow. I've never been asked that question before, and I've never considered it. Probably any decision. As a Christian, any decision I make wouldn't be particularly popular. But
you're only going to be for a day, so it doesn't matter.
That's true, so I can run away and no consequences. That's good. I mean, the whole right to life discussion is a huge one. And, we have just over the last 2 months, we have shut down our economies in the West. We have totally restructured our lives, and we've done, we've taken very drastic measures to protect people because we value their life. And in Australia, unfortunately, only 60 or so have succumbed to the coronavirus. Many more could have. But we have, made radical changes to our lives, and we've potentially crashed our economy and done all sorts of crazy stuff because we value life. And yet, in Australia, some 80,000 to 100,000 unborn babies are killed every year. And this is just, it's unfathomable to me that we can.
I'm going to cut in there and just say that I'm actually very ropeable about this entire matter.
Yeah.
We have cancelled elective surgeries in which some people are actually suffering and need that elective surgery at the same time. Actually, I know this is not where you're going, but at the same time, we've considered abortion an essential service, and it's still going on.
It's crazy. Churches are closed, but abortion clinics are open.
But that's nuts. It's nuts.
Yeah, it is nuts.
And I've expressed my frustration about that, and I'm happy to do it publicly as I am now. But anyway, continue on. Prime Minister for the day, continue on.
Yeah. I mean, good on you for doing that, because it takes balls to do it. But yeah, like in America, people are saying the same thing. Churches have been closed because they're not considered essential, and yet abortion clinics are open, and they're still killing people while we're trying to save others. It just doesn't make sense. And so I don't know, like I would do something on that issue. I think it's an absolute tragedy that so many unborn are killed every year. And I know that the original reasons in America, Roe v. Wade, and some of our original legislation, what was argued was in the extreme cases of someone who unfortunately would have been raped, or if there's, a risk of life, the mother's life being taken, they were the reasons that were kind of argued at a legislative level for legalizing abortion. And now, all these decades later, those particular cases only make up some, 1 to 3% of abortions. The vast majority are made for. I know that it's not necessarily easy circumstances. I'm certainly not saying that, but it's a lot of different reasons. That's right. It's abortion on demand, and in some places,
birth in some
that's
states.
exactly right. So. I mean, this is one of the things that I'm very passionate about, and if I was Prime Minister for a day and I could run away from the consequences, I would protect life in a way that it hasn't been protected in decades.
All right. Well, I'd be voting one Kurt Mahlburg. That's very good. Well, look, Kurt, I'd love to come back and talk to you again in the future, perhaps closer to when your book's done. We can talk about your book, but maybe even
I would love to do that. Yeah, fantastic.
Thank you very much for joining me for this very first edition of Conservative One, the podcast that's defending traditions and freedom. Thanks very much, Kurt.
Thanks so much, George. Catch you next time.
Goodbye, and God bless to all the listeners.
We will decide who comes to this country and the circumstances in which they come.
We'll preserve for our children this, the last best hope of man on earth, or we'll sentence them to take the last step into 1,000 years of darkness.
You've been listening to the Conservative One podcast with George Christensen.